Margaret Hale stood at her frost-covered window, watching the storm devour the prairie, certain she would die alone in this house. At 52, she had made peace with it. The silence, the cold, the slow surrender of her land to debt and decay. Love was a memory from another lifetime, buried with her husband in the hard ground outside. But on this bitter December night in 1882, 3 sharp knocks would shatter that certainty forever. She had no idea that opening her door would mean opening her heart one last time, to a man who had been searching for her his entire life. If you're watching from somewhere in this big world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Margaret's story travels. And if her journey moves you, hit that like button. Now, let's step back to where it all began. The wind came mean that December, the kind that found every crack in the walls and reminded you that warmth was a privilege, not a promise. Margaret Hale moved through her small homestead like a ghost through its own haunting, her wool shawl pulled tight against shoulders that had learned to carry weight without complaint. The house creaked and settled around her, familiar as her own breathing, empty as her own heart. She stood at the kitchen table, studying the ledger that had become her nightly torment. The numbers didn't lie, though she had stared at them long enough to wish they would. 3 months behind on the banknote, the fence on the north pasture collapsing, the roof over the barn sagging like a broken promise, and her, a 52-year-old widow with calloused hands and a back that ached in the mornings, trying to hold together a piece of Kansas prairie that seemed determined to return to dust. "Foolish woman," she muttered to herself, her voice rough from disuse, thinking you could manage this alone. But alone was all she had. Her husband Thomas had been dead 7 years come spring, kicked by a horse he was trying to break, gone before the doctor could even arrive from town. Her daughter Emma had married a merchant and moved to St. Louis, her letters growing shorter and less frequent with each passing year. Her son James had gone west to the silver mines of Colorado, chasing dreams that glittered brighter than family obligation. They had their own lives now, their own struggles. She couldn't ask them to come back to this failing patch of earth, couldn't bear to see pity in their eyes when they looked at what she'd become. Margaret closed the ledger and moved to the window, pressing her forehead against the cold glass. Outside, the storm was building, the sky gone the color of old bruises, the wind whipping snow across the frozen fields in ghostly spirals. The barn door she'd meant to fix last week banged rhythmically against its frame, a lonely percussion that matched the beating of her solitary heart. She had been beautiful once, not striking, perhaps, but pleasant. Brown hair that caught auburn in the sunlight, clear blue eyes, a ready smile. Thomas had courted her with wildflowers and awkward poetry, and she had loved him with the fierce certainty of youth. They had built this homestead together, raised their children here, dreamed of growing old while watching their grandchildren play in these same fields. But dreams had a way of curdling in the harsh light of reality. Now, when she caught her reflection in the window glass, she saw a stranger. A woman with gray streaking through brown hair pulled back in a severe knot, lines etched deep around eyes that had learned not to hope too much, a mouth that had forgotten how to smile without reason. Her hands were rough as tree bark, her body lean and hard from work that never ended. She looked like what she was, a woman who had survived but forgotten how to live. "Too old," she whispered to her reflection. "Too old for softness, too old for foolish notions. Too old for love." That was the truth she had accepted 3 years ago, when John Peterson from the neighboring farm had come calling with his hat in his hands and hope in his eyes. He was a good man, recently widowed himself, looking for companionship in the long prairie nights. But Margaret had looked at him and felt nothing, no flutter, no warmth, no desire to let anyone close enough to lose again. She had thanked him kindly and closed the door, and he had never come back. Since then, she had built her walls higher, stronger. She rose before dawn to tend the few chickens that still laid, hauled water from the well until her shoulders screamed, mended fences with wire and determination. She cooked simple meals for one, read by lamplight until her eyes ached, slept in the center of the bed Thomas had built, and told herself this was enough. This had to be enough. The wind shrieked, and something heavy crashed against the side of the house. Margaret flinched, then forced herself to straighten. Probably a branch from the old cottonwood, though she wouldn't know until morning. Nothing to be done about it now except wait for the storm to pass. As she waited for everything to pass, seasons, years, life itself. She turned from the window and began her nightly ritual, banking the fire in the stove, checking that the door was latched, trimming the lamp wick. Simple tasks, familiar routines. They kept the chaos at bay, kept her moving forward through days that all looked the same. She was reaching for the lamp when the knock came. 3 sharp raps against the door, solid and unmistakable. Margaret froze, her hand hovering over the brass knob of the lamp. For a moment she thought she'd imagined it, the wind playing tricks, her lonely mind conjuring company from nothing. But then it came again, more insistent now, accompanied by a man's voice, rough and urgent. "Please, anyone home? Please, we need help." Her heart hammered against her ribs. No one traveled in weather like this. No one came to her door anymore, especially not at night, especially not strangers. Every story she'd ever heard about trouble arriving after dark flashed through her mind. Outlaws, drifters, men who took what they wanted and left only grief behind. But that voice had said we. And there was something in it, not threat, but desperation. The knock came a third time, weaker now. Margaret grabbed the shotgun Thomas had kept by the door, checked that it was loaded, and approached slowly. Her hands were steadier than her breath. "Who's there?" she called through the wood. "Name's Caleb Rowan, ma'am. I've got my boy with me. We're caught in the storm. Horse went lame 2 miles back. We just need shelter till morning. Please." The voice cracked on that last word, and Margaret heard something in it that decided her. Exhaustion, yes, but also fear. Not for himself, she thought, but for the child. Still, she kept the shotgun in her hands as she lifted the latch and opened the door just wide enough to see out. The wind nearly tore it from her grasp, bringing with it a swirl of snow and 2 figures huddled on her porch. The man was tall, broad-shouldered beneath a snow-covered duster, his hat pulled low against the wind. But it was the small figure he held that caught Margaret's eye. A boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wrapped in a blanket that was already soaked through, his face pressed against the man's chest. The man looked up, and even in the dim light spilling from her doorway, Margaret could see the weariness in his face, the lines of someone who had traveled too far and too hard. But his eyes, dark and direct, held no malice, only urgent hope. "Please, ma'am," he said again. "I wouldn't ask if I had any choice. The boy's cold clean through. I just need to warm him up, and we'll be gone by first light. I swear it." Margaret looked at the child, really looked, and saw his lips had gone blue, his small body shaking with shivers that wouldn't stop. She thought of her own children, small and vulnerable once, and how she would have prayed for someone to help them if they'd been caught in a storm like this. She lowered the shotgun. "Get inside," she said, stepping back, "quickly, before all my heat escapes." The man didn't wait for her to change her mind. He ducked through the doorway, the boy still clutched against his chest, and Margaret slammed the door against the wind. Snow had already drifted into her small entryway, and she could feel the cold radiating off both of them like they'd brought the storm inside with them. "There," she said, pointing to the chairs she'd pulled close to the stove earlier. "Sit. I'll get blankets." The man lowered himself into the chair carefully, as if every muscle hurt, but he didn't release the boy. "Noah," he murmured, his voice gentler than before. "Son, we're inside now. You're safe." The child made a small sound but didn't lift his head. Margaret disappeared into her bedroom and returned with every blanket she owned, her mind racing. She hadn't had anyone in this house since Emma's last visit 2 years ago, hadn't cooked for anyone but herself, hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to another living soul in weeks. And now here were these strangers dripping melted snow onto her clean floor, bringing disruption and need into the careful solitude she'd constructed. She should resent it. She wanted to resent it. But as she approached the stove and saw the man carefully peeling wet layers off the shivering child, his big hands moving with surprising gentleness, she felt something else entirely, something she didn't want to name. "How long were you out there?" she asked, kneeling to help. "Since noon," the man, Caleb, said. "We were making for Clearwater, but the storm came up faster than expected. Horse stepped in a hole about 2 miles back, broke something in his leg. Had to put him down." His voice went flat on those last words. "Saw your light from the road. It was the only light for miles." Margaret nodded, pulling off the boy's sodden boots. His feet were like ice, and she immediately began rubbing them between her hands, trying to bring back circulation. "Noah, is it? Can you hear me, Noah?" The boy's eyes fluttered open, dark like his father's, but glazed with exhaustion and cold. "Yes, ma'am," he whispered. "Good boy. We're going to warm you up, all right? But I need you to stay awake for me. Can you do that?" A small nod. Caleb was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I know you don't know us from Adam. I know it's a risk letting strangers in, but I give you my word. We mean you no harm. I'm just trying to get my boy somewhere safe." Margaret kept her eyes on Noah, unwrapping the wet blanket and replacing it with a dry one. "Where's his mother?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "Dead?" Caleb said finally. 2 years ago. Fever took her before the doctor could do anything." "I'm sorry," Margaret said, and meant it. She knew that particular grief, the way it hollowed you out and left you stumbling through days that had lost their color. "We've managed," Caleb said. "Me and Noah. We move around some, go where the work is. I hire on at ranches, do breaking and training. We were heading to a job near Clearwater when—" He gestured helplessly at the storm outside. Margaret stood, assessing the situation with the practical eye she'd developed through years of survival. The boy needed warm food and dry clothes. The man needed the same, though he'd deny it. She could see the way he was holding himself rigid, using sheer will to keep from shaking. "I'll make coffee," she said. "And soup. There's not much, but it's hot." "Ma'am, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Margaret interrupted, her voice sharper than intended. "But that boy needs food in his belly, and arguing with me wastes time. So sit there, stay by the fire, and let me do what needs doing." A ghost of a smile touched Caleb's weathered face. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret moved to her small kitchen, acutely aware of the strangers in her home, aware of how her hands shook slightly as she reached for the coffee tin. She hadn't entertained guests in so long, hadn't had to think about anyone's needs but her own. It felt strange, unsettling, like wearing a dress she'd long since outgrown. But as she worked, hearing the low murmur of Caleb's voice as he spoke quietly to his son, something in her chest loosened just a fraction. The house felt different with voices in it, less like a tomb, more like what it used to be when Thomas was alive and the children small, a place where people lived, not just existed. She shook her head, dismissing the thought. They would be gone by morning, and she would return to her solitude. This was just one night, just shelter from a storm. Nothing more. The coffee began to bubble, filling the small house with its rich aroma. Margaret ladled soup, thin vegetable broth with a bit of salt pork, into 2 bowls and carried them to the fire. Noah had stopped shivering quite so violently, though he was still pale. He took the bowl with both hands, his eyes wide and solemn. "Thank you, ma'am." "You're welcome. Eat slowly now. Don't make yourself sick." Caleb accepted his bowl with a nod of gratitude, but Margaret noticed he waited until Noah had taken several spoonfuls before taking any himself. A father's instinct. Make sure the child is cared for first. She remembered Thomas doing the same during the hard years, pretending he wasn't hungry so the children could have more. She poured coffee and handed a cup to Caleb, their fingers brushing briefly. His hands were rough with work, scarred and capable. Working hands, like her own. "How long have you been on your own?" Caleb asked quietly, glancing around the small house. "If you don't mind my asking." Margaret stiffened, then forced herself to relax. It was a reasonable question, given the circumstances. 7 years, my husband died. My children are grown and gone. It's just me now." "And you manage this place alone?" "I manage what I can." She sat in her own chair, cradling her coffee cup. "It's not much, but it's mine." Caleb nodded slowly, and she could see him taking in details. The neat but shabby interior, the careful mending on the curtains, the ledger still open on the table. Reading her life in the details, the way she'd read his in the careful way he held his son. "That takes strength," he said. "Staying, building. Most folks would have given up, sold out." Margaret laughed, a bitter sound. "Given up to who? Nobody wants this land. It barely produces enough to keep one person fed, let alone turn a profit. I stay because there's nowhere else to go." "I don't believe that," Caleb said. She looked up sharply. "Excuse me?" "I don't believe you stay just because you're stuck. You stay because this place matters to you, because giving up would mean all those years, all that work, all that grief would be for nothing. Margaret stared at him, unsettled by how easily he'd seen through her defenses to the truth underneath. She opened her mouth to deny it, then closed it again. What was the point? He was a stranger passing through. By morning, he'd be gone, and it wouldn't matter what he thought he knew about her. Finish your soup, she said instead, standing abruptly. I'll make up a place for you both to sleep. She busied herself pulling out the old bedroll from the closet, the one Emma had used on camping trips as a girl. It smelled faintly of cedar and memories. She laid it on the floor near the stove where it would be warmest, adding pillows and more blankets. Behind her, she could hear Caleb helping Noah out of his damp clothes and into dry ones. Margaret's own nightshirt, which hung on the boy like a tent but was warm and soft. Noah's eyes were already drooping, exhaustion finally catching up with him now that he was warm and fed. Bedtime, son, Caleb murmured. Say thank you to Miss Margaret. Thank you, Miss Margaret, Noah mumbled, already half asleep. You're welcome, child. Sleep well. Caleb carried him to the bedroll and tucked him in with the care of someone who'd performed this ritual 1,000 times. Noah was asleep before his head settled onto the pillow, his small face peaceful in the lamplight. Margaret found herself staring at the scene, the man kneeling beside his sleeping son, one hand resting protectively on the child's shoulder. There was such tenderness in it, such quiet devotion. It made her chest ache with something she couldn't name. He's a good boy, Caleb said, looking up and catching her gaze. Had to grow up faster than he should have, but he's never complained, not once. He's lucky to have you. I'm lucky to have him. He's all I've got in this world. Caleb stood, his knees cracking slightly. Which is why I'm grateful you let us in. I know it wasn't easy, taking in strangers, especially out here, where anything could happen. Margaret crossed her arms, suddenly aware of how small her house was, how close they were standing. You gave me your word you meant no harm. And I do. But you only had my word to go on. That takes trust. He paused, studying her face. Or maybe just kindness. Either way, I won't forget it. Margaret felt heat rising in her cheeks and turned away, busying herself with cleaning the soup bowls. It's just one night. The storm will pass, and you'll be on your way. If that's what you want, yes. Something in his tone made her pause, her hands stilling in the dishwater. What else would I want? I noticed things, Caleb said carefully. Coming in, the fence post leaning out front, the barn door that needs fixing, the roof showing its age. He held up a hand when she turned to face him, her expression defensive. Not judging, just noticing, and thinking that maybe, if you were willing, I could work on some of those things before we move on. Payment for your hospitality. I don't need charity, Margaret said, her voice tight. It's not charity. It's exchange. Fair work for fair shelter. He took a step closer, and she could see the sincerity in his dark eyes. I'm good with my hands, ma'am. I can fix what's broken, and from what I saw, there's plenty that could use fixing. Pride warred with practicality in Margaret's chest. She did need help, desperately. The fence wouldn't survive another hard wind. The barn door would eventually tear free and be lost to the prairie. And the roof. God, the roof would be the death of her when spring rains came. But letting him stay meant disruption. It meant noise and presence, and the constant reminder that she wasn't alone anymore, even temporarily. It meant risk. I can pay you, she said finally. A little. Not much, but don't want payment, Caleb interrupted gently. Just want to leave knowing I gave back what I received. Call it pride if you want. Call it gratitude. But let me do this. Margaret looked at him, really looked, seeing past the weather-worn exterior to the man beneath. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe mid-30s, though life had clearly been hard on him. There was strength in his frame, but also weariness. Capability in his stance, but also loneliness. He was like her, she realized, a survivor. Someone who kept moving because stopping meant feeling everything you'd lost. 3 days, she heard herself say. You can stay 3 days, do what repairs you can, then you need to move on. Relief flickered across his face. 3 days, you have my word. Your word seems to be all I have, Margaret said, but there was no heat in it. Caleb smiled, a real smile this time, not just a ghost of one, and it transformed his face, making him look younger, less burdened. Then I'll make sure it's worth something. They stood there in the lamplight, the storm howling outside, the sleeping child between them, and Margaret felt the walls she'd built so carefully beginning to shift, just slightly, just enough to let in a crack of light. "You should sleep," she said, breaking the moment. "You look dead on your feet." "I am," Caleb admitted, "but I wanted to thank you first, properly. You saved my boy's life tonight. Maybe mine too. That's not nothing. It's what anyone would do." "No," he said quietly. "It's what you did, and that makes all the difference." Margaret didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply nodded and retreated to her bedroom, closing the door between them. She leaned against it, her heart beating too fast, her carefully ordered world suddenly feeling unstable beneath her feet. Through the door, she could hear Caleb banking the fire, moving quietly so as not to wake Noah. She heard him settle onto the floor near his son, heard the rustle of blankets, and then silence. Margaret moved to her window and looked out at the storm. It showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it seemed to be intensifying, the wind driving snow against the glass in waves. 3 days, she'd said. But looking at that storm, she suspected it might be longer. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, she felt something else, something dangerous and foolish and utterly unwelcome. She felt anticipation. "Foolish woman," she whispered to herself again, but this time it sounded different. Less like resignation, more like possibility. Outside, the wind screamed and the snow fell, burying the prairie under layers of white. Inside, 3 strangers to loneliness, a widow, a widower, and a fatherless boy, slept under the same roof, their breathing falling into rhythm as the storm raged on. And in the morning, everything would change. Margaret didn't know it yet, standing at her window, watching the storm. She didn't know that the man sleeping in her front room would teach her that age was no barrier to love, that grief was no excuse for surrender, that the heart was capable of healing even after it had forgotten how. She didn't know that she was standing at the edge of the rest of her life, that opening her door to strangers in a storm would mean opening herself to hope one more time. She didn't know any of it, but somewhere deep inside, in a place she'd thought long dead, something stirred, something that felt remarkably like the beginning of something new. The storm would pass, the sun would rise, and Margaret Hale, who thought she was too old for love, would discover that some stories are just waiting for the right moment to begin. She just had to be brave enough to let them. Morning came reluctant and gray, the storm having exhausted itself sometime before dawn. Margaret woke to unfamiliar sounds, the creak of floorboards that weren't hers, the low murmur of voices, the smell of coffee she hadn't made. For a disorienting moment, she forgot about her visitors, and panic seized her chest. Then memory returned, and with it, a complicated tangle of emotions she didn't want to examine too closely. She dressed quickly in the cold room, pulling on her worn work dress and pinning her hair back with practiced efficiency. Through the thin walls, she could hear Caleb speaking softly to Noah, the kind of patient morning conversation between a father and son that she hadn't heard in this house for far too long. When she emerged from her bedroom, she found them both dressed, and the fire already stoked, warmth spreading through the small space. Caleb stood at her stove, and the sight of a man in her kitchen, using her things, occupying her space, sent a jolt through her that was equal parts intrusion and something else she refused to name. "Morning," Caleb said, turning with a cup in his hand. "Hope you don't mind. Made coffee. Seemed the least I could do." "I can make my own coffee," Margaret said, sharper than she intended. Caleb's expression didn't change, but she saw understanding flicker in his eyes. "I'm sure you can, but it's already made, so you might as well drink it." Noah sat at the table, his small hands wrapped around his own cup. Milk, probably, with just enough coffee to make him feel grown. He looked better this morning, color back in his cheeks, though his clothes were still damp where they hung by the fire. "Morning, Miss Margaret," he said politely. "Good morning, Noah. How are you feeling?" "Warm," the boy said, and smiled, a gap-toothed grin that tugged at something in Margaret's chest. She accepted the coffee Caleb offered, their fingers brushing again as they had the night before. His hands were warm from the cup, steady and sure. She pulled away quickly and moved to the window, needing distance, needing to resettle herself in her own space. Outside, the world had transformed overnight. Snow lay thick across the prairie, smoothing every rough edge, covering every imperfection in a blanket of white. The fence posts barely showed above the drifts. The path to the barn had disappeared entirely. It would take hours to dig out, and even then, travel would be treacherous. "Storm hit hard," Caleb said, coming to stand beside her. Not too close, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "Roads won't be passable for days, I'd wager." Margaret's stomach tightened. "So much for leaving this morning. I gave you my word we'd be gone as soon as we could, but I can't take Noah out in that. It'd be dangerous, and after last night—" He trailed off, and she knew what he wasn't saying. After how close they'd come to freezing, he wouldn't risk his son again. "The 3 days still stand," Margaret heard herself say. "Storm or no storm. You can work on repairs while you're here, like you offered." Relief crossed Caleb's face. "Thank you. I'll earn our keep, I promise you that." "See that you do," Margaret said, but her voice had lost its edge. She was trapped, not by the storm exactly, but by her own inability to turn away someone in need, especially a child, especially when she had the means to help, however meager. They ate a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush and the last of Margaret's preserves. Noah ate with the single-minded focus of a growing boy, but Caleb kept glancing at her, as if trying to figure her out. She didn't like being studied, didn't like the way his attention made her feel exposed. "So, what needs fixing most?" Caleb asked, breaking the silence. Margaret considered. "The fence is the priority. North pasture is completely open. If I had any livestock left, they'd be halfway to Missouri by now. After that, the barn door. Then—" She hesitated. "The roof. But that's a bigger job. Might be more than you can manage in a few days." "Let me assess it," Caleb said. "I've patched more roofs than I can count. Might surprise you what I can do." "I don't like surprises," Margaret said flatly. Caleb smiled slightly. "Noted." After breakfast, while Noah helped Margaret clear the dishes, his small hands careful with her precious few plates, Caleb bundled up and headed outside to survey the damage. Margaret watched from the window as he waded through snow that came past his knees, his broad shoulders set against the wind that still gusted across the open prairie. "Papa's real good at fixing things," Noah said beside her, his voice proud. "He can fix anything." "Can he now?" "Yep. Last place we stayed, the whole barn roof was falling in. Papa fixed it in 3 days, all by himself. The man who owned it said Papa was a miracle worker." Margaret glanced down at the boy. "Your papa moves around a lot, does he?" Noah nodded, his expression growing more subdued. "Ever since Mama died. Papa says we go where the work is, says as long as we got each other, we got a home." "That's a nice thought," Margaret said, though privately she thought it sounded exhausting. Never settling, never putting down roots, always moving on to the next job, the next town. But then, who was she to judge? At least Caleb and Noah had each other. She had only this failing homestead and her stubborn pride. "Do you get lonely?" Noah asked suddenly, his dark eyes too knowing for a child. "Living all alone out here?" The question struck deeper than Margaret expected. "I'm used to it," she said, which wasn't an answer. "Papa says being used to something and liking it aren't the same thing." "Your papa says a lot," Margaret observed. "He thinks a lot too, especially at night when he thinks I'm sleeping. I hear him sometimes, moving around, looking out windows. Mama used to say he had a restless spirit." Margaret felt something twist in her chest. Recognition, perhaps. She knew about restless spirits, about nights spent staring into darkness, about the exhausting work of carrying on when everything inside you wanted to stop. Outside, Caleb had reached the barn and was examining the door that hung crooked on its hinges. Even from a distance, she could see the concentration in his stance, the way he tested the frame, checking for rot and weakness. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew his craft, who had spent years learning to read wood and metal and stone. "Your papa's lucky to have you," Margaret said to Noah. "I hope he knows that." "He tells me every day," Noah said simply. "Says I'm his reason for everything." The casual certainty in the boy's voice, the absolute security of being loved and knowing it, made Margaret's throat tight. Her own children had known that once, when they were small. But somewhere along the way, between Thomas's death and their departure, the expressions of affection had dried up, replaced by duty and obligation and unspoken resentment. They had loved her, she thought, but they hadn't liked her much by the end, this bitter woman who clung to a dying farm instead of following them to new lives. She turned from the window abruptly. I have work to do. Chickens need tending, even in snow. You stay inside where it's warm. Can I help? Noah asked eagerly. Margaret almost said no automatically, then stopped. The boy was looking at her with such hope, such eagerness to be useful. And really, what harm could it do? He'd be gone in a few days anyway. Bundle up warm, she said, and stay close. The wind's still mean. Noah's face lit up like she'd given him a present, and he rushed to pull on his mostly dry coat. Margaret found herself smiling despite herself as she wrapped her own shawl tight and led the way to the door. The cold hit like a physical blow, stealing her breath. The snow had drifted high against the house, and they had to wade through it to reach the chicken coop. Noah struggled gamely, his shorter legs working hard to keep up, his breath coming in small clouds. The chickens were huddled together for warmth, ruffled and indignant at the intrusion. Margaret scattered feed while Noah watched with wide eyes, fascinated by the way the birds pecked and squabbled. We never stayed anywhere long enough to keep chickens, he said. Papa says maybe someday, when we find the right place. Chickens are more trouble than they're worth half the time, Margaret said, though she spoke fondly. These birds were her only reliable company, the only living things that depended on her. But they give eggs, which makes them useful. Papa says everything's got its purpose. You just got to figure out what it is. Your papa's full of wisdom, Margaret said dryly. He is, Noah agreed, missing the irony entirely. He knows about horses and cows and building things and fixing things, and he knows stories too. At night he tells me stories about when he was young, before Mama died. They sound happy, those stories. I'm sure they are, Margaret said softly. They finished with the chickens and trudged back toward the house, Margaret's back already aching from the cold. Halfway there, Noah suddenly stopped and pointed toward the barn. Look, Papa's on the roof! Margaret's heart jumped into her throat. Sure enough, Caleb had somehow climbed up to the barn roof and was examining the sagging section, his body balanced confidently against the slope. The sight made her dizzy. One wrong move, one patch of ice, and he could fall, break his neck, leave his son an orphan in a stranger's house. Get down from there, you fool, she shouted, not caring how she sounded. Caleb looked up, startled, then waved. Even from this distance, she could see his grin. Just looking. Be down in a minute. Be down now before you kill yourself. He laughed, actually laughed, and began making his way carefully to the edge. Margaret's hands were clenched so tight her nails bit into her palms. Beside her, Noah seemed unconcerned, as if watching his father risk his life on icy roofs was perfectly normal. He does this all the time, the boy said. Papa's real careful. He never falls. There's a first time for everything, Margaret muttered. Caleb reached the edge and lowered himself down, dropping the last few feet into a snowdrift. He came toward them, brushing snow off his clothes, still grinning like a boy who'd pulled off a prank. Good news, he said. Roof's not as bad as it looks. Needs new shingles in places and some support beams reinforced, but the structure's sound. I can fix it. You can fix it by breaking your neck? Margaret snapped. What were you thinking, climbing up there in this weather? His grin faded, replaced by something more serious. I was thinking I needed to see the problem to solve it. I'm not reckless, Margaret. I've got a boy to raise. I don't take unnecessary risks. The use of her given name, not ma'am, not Miss Margaret, but just Margaret, sent a jolt through her. It felt intimate, presumptuous. It felt like he was claiming some kind of familiarity he hadn't earned. Mrs. Hale, she corrected coldly. Caleb's expression shifted, understanding dawning. Mrs. Hale, he repeated, his voice formal now. My apologies. I overstepped. Margaret felt a flash of something that might have been regret, but she pushed it down. Better to keep distance. Better to maintain the walls. In a few days, he'd be gone anyway. The fence, she said. Can you start on that today? Yes, ma'am. I'll need to dig through the snow to see what we're working with, but I should be able to shore up the worst of it before dark. Fine. Noah can help me inside. She turned and headed back to the house without waiting for a response, Noah trailing behind her. Inside, she kept herself busy with chores, scrubbing floors that didn't need scrubbing, reorganizing shelves that were already organized, anything to avoid thinking about the man outside working in the cold, anything to avoid the memory of his laugh, the way he'd said her name. Noah settled at the table with a piece of paper and a pencil Margaret had given him, drawing careful pictures of chickens and horses. Every so often, he'd look up at her with those serious dark eyes, and she'd feel the weight of his attention. "You're mad at Papa," he said finally. Margaret paused in her work. "I'm not mad." "You sound mad. Your voice got all tight and cold." She sighed, setting down her dish rag. "Your papa scared me climbing on that roof." "People get hurt doing foolish things." "He wasn't being foolish," Noah said with the absolute certainty of a child defending his father. "He was being helpful. There's a difference." "Maybe," Margaret conceded, "but helpful doesn't mean much if you're laid up with a broken leg." "Papa wouldn't let himself get hurt. He promised me after Mama died. He said he'd always be careful, that he wouldn't leave me alone." The simple faith in Noah's voice made Margaret's chest ache. She remembered Emma at that age, believing absolutely that her parents would always be there, that nothing bad could happen as long as Thomas was around. And then Thomas had died anyway, kicked by a horse on an ordinary Tuesday, and Emma's certainty had shattered like glass. "Your papa seems like a good man," Margaret said carefully, "but nobody can promise they won't get hurt. Life doesn't work that way." "I know," Noah said, and the sadness in his voice was too old for his years. "But Papa tries anyway. He says trying matters, even if you can't control everything." Margaret returned to her work, but the boy's words stayed with her. Trying matters. When had she stopped trying? When had survival become enough? When had she accepted that this half-life was all she deserved? The day wore on, the sun breaking through clouds to turn the snow-covered prairie into a blinding white expanse. Through the window, Margaret could see Caleb working on the fence, his movements steady and methodical despite the cold. He'd removed his coat and worked in just his shirt, his breath steaming in the frigid air. She found her eyes drawn to him again and again, the strength in his shoulders, the competence in his hands, the focused determination that reminded her painfully of Thomas in his prime. By late afternoon, Caleb came back inside, his face reddened from wind and cold, his hands raw despite the gloves he wore. But there was satisfaction in his expression, the look of a man who'd accomplished something meaningful. "Got the worst of the fence shored up," he reported, accepting the coffee Margaret handed him. "Won't win any beauty contests, but it'll hold through winter. Come spring, you'll want to replace some of the posts entirely. They're rotted through at the base, but for now, it's solid." "Thank you," Margaret said, and meant it. "Tomorrow I'll tackle that barn door. Day after, I'll start on the roof." He paused, studying her face. "If that's still all right with you." "The storm's not letting up anytime soon," Margaret said, gesturing to the window where fresh snow had begun to fall. "Looks like you're stuck here whether either of us likes it or not." "And do you?" Caleb asked quietly. "Like it, I mean?" The question caught her off guard, too direct, too personal. She busied herself with stirring the stew she'd started for dinner. "What I like doesn't matter. What matters is Noah staying warm and safe until the road's clear." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer you're getting," Margaret said. But there was no real heat in it. Caleb smiled slightly and let it drop, turning his attention to his son. "What have you been up to, Noah? Helping Mrs. Hale?" "Drew pictures," Noah said, showing his father the careful sketches. "And we fed the chickens, and I learned that chickens are trouble but useful." Caleb laughed, the sound warm and genuine, and Margaret felt something in her soften despite herself. This was what her house had been missing: laughter, warmth, the sound of people living instead of just existing. It felt good. It felt dangerous. That night, they ate together again, the three of them around the small table. The stew was thin but hot, and Noah ate 2 bowls while Caleb told stories about horses he'd broken, places they'd been, characters they'd met on the road. He had a gift for storytelling, painting pictures with words, and Margaret found herself drawn in despite her determination to remain distant. "There was this one horse in Colorado," Caleb was saying, his eyes bright with memory, black as midnight and meaner than sin. Owner said nobody could break him, that he was too wild. But I watched that horse, studied him for 3 days, and I realized he wasn't mean. He was scared. Someone had hurt him bad, and he'd learned to hurt back first. What did you do? Noah asked, though Margaret suspected he'd heard this story before. I sat in his pen, didn't try to touch him, didn't try to ride him, just sat there day after day, letting him see I wasn't going to hurt him. Took 2 weeks before he let me touch his nose, another week before he'd let me put a blanket on his back. But eventually, he learned to trust again. Last I heard, he was the gentlest saddle horse in 3 counties. That's a nice story, Margaret said, but not all scared things learn to trust again. Caleb looked at her, and she felt pinned by his gaze. No, he agreed, not all. But some do, if they're given reason to, if someone's patient enough to wait. The air between them felt suddenly charged, thick with meaning Margaret didn't want to acknowledge. She stood abruptly, gathering dishes. It's late. Noah should sleep. If Caleb noticed her retreat, he didn't comment. He simply helped his son prepare for bed, the same gentle routine as the night before. Margaret watched from the corner of her eye as he tucked Noah in, brushed hair back from the boy's forehead, whispered something that made Noah smile. Good night, Mrs. Hale, Noah called sleepily. Good night, Noah. After the boy was asleep, Margaret and Caleb sat in awkward silence, the fire crackling between them. Margaret pretended to read, though the words swam on the page. Caleb worked on a piece of leather tack he'd pulled from his pack, his hands moving with practiced ease. Can I ask you something? He said after a while. Margaret stiffened. Depends on the question. Your children. Do they know how hard you're working to keep this place running? It was not the question she'd expected, and it hit harder because of it. They know. Do they help? They have their own lives. That's not the same as helping. Margaret set down her book. What do you want me to say? That my children abandoned me? That they couldn't wait to escape this place and the bitter woman running it? Fine, that's the truth. They're gone, and they're not coming back, and I've made my peace with it. Have you? Caleb asked gently. I have to, Margaret said, her voice cracking despite her best efforts. What choice do I have? I can't force them to care. Can't make them want to be here. So I do what I can, alone, and I try not to think too hard about how I drove them away. You didn't drive them away, Caleb said with such certainty that Margaret wanted to believe him. People leave for all kinds of reasons. Usually, it's about them, not about you. You don't know that. You don't know what kind of mother I was after Thomas died. I know you took in 2 strangers during a storm. I know you fed us and sheltered us when you had every reason to turn us away. I know you've worked yourself near to breaking trying to hold on to something that matters to you. That tells me plenty about who you are. Margaret felt tears pricking at her eyes and blinked them back furiously. You don't know me. Maybe not yet, Caleb said, but I'd like to. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Margaret stood, needing to escape before she said something she'd regret. I'm going to bed. Bank the fire before you sleep. She fled to her room and closed the door, leaning against it with her heart hammering. Through the thin walls, she could hear Caleb moving around, settling in for the night. She pressed her hands to her face, feeling the heat in her cheeks, the confusion roiling in her chest. This was exactly what she'd feared. The disruption, the complication, the unwanted stirring of feelings she'd thought long buried. Caleb was kind and capable and saw her in ways that made her uncomfortable. And in just 2 days, he'd already begun to chip away at the walls she'd spent 7 years building. She couldn't allow it. Wouldn't allow it. He was passing through, nothing more. In a week, maybe less, the roads would clear and he'd be gone, taking his son and his easy smiles and his patient wisdom with him. She'd return to her solitude, and this would become just another memory, brief and bittersweet and ultimately meaningless. That's what she told herself as she lay in the darkness, listening to the house settle around her. But deep down, in a place she tried hard to ignore, she knew the truth. Caleb Rowan had already changed something fundamental. The door she'd opened during the storm had let in more than just 2 travelers seeking shelter. It had let in possibility. Hope. The dangerous notion that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late after all. And that terrified her more than any storm ever could. The pattern established itself over the next few days, with a rhythm that felt both foreign and dangerously familiar. Margaret would wake to find Caleb already up, coffee made, fire stoked. They'd share breakfast in careful silence while Noah chattered between them, oblivious to the tension his father and their reluctant host tried to ignore. Then Caleb would head outside to work, while Margaret kept busy inside, Noah drifting between them like a small ambassador between two wary nations. By the fourth day, the barn door hung straight and true. The fence stood solid against the drifts, and Caleb had begun the painstaking work on the roof. Margaret watched him from the kitchen window more than she cared to admit, her stomach tight with worry every time he climbed that ladder, her breath catching whenever he moved too close to the edge. "You keep staring at him like that. You'll burn a hole right through him," she muttered to herself, forcing her attention back to the bread dough she was kneading. But her eyes drifted back anyway, drawn by something she couldn't name and didn't want to examine. The way he moved with such confidence despite the danger, the careful precision of his work. The fact that he was doing all of this for her, asking nothing in return except the shelter she'd have given anyway. "Mrs. Hale?" Noah's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret looked down to find the boy watching her with those two knowing eyes. "What is it?" "Do you think we could stay? Not just till the storm's over, like really stay?" The question landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through everything Margaret had been trying not to feel. "This isn't your home, Noah. You and your papa, you move around. That's your way. But what if we didn't want to move anymore? What if we wanted to stay somewhere?" The boy's voice was small, hopeful in a way that broke Margaret's heart. "Papa works real hard, and you got lots of work that needs doing, and I could help too. I'm good at helping." Margaret set down her dough and knelt so she was eye level with the child. "Noah, honey, your papa has jobs waiting other places, people counting on him. You can't just stop wandering because you found one place you like." "Why not?" Noah asked with the simple logic of a child. "If the place is good and the people are good, why keep looking?" Before Margaret could answer, the door banged open and Caleb stumbled inside, his face pale beneath the windburn, his left hand cradled against his chest. Blood seeped between his fingers, dripping onto her clean floor. "Papa!" Noah's cry was sharp with fear. Margaret's training from years of farm life kicked in instantly. She grabbed Caleb's arm and guided him to a chair, her hands already reaching for the hand he protected. "Let me see." "It's nothing," Caleb said through gritted teeth. "Hammer slipped, caught my palm." "Let me see," Margaret repeated, her voice brooking no argument. Caleb reluctantly uncurled his fingers, revealing a deep gash across his palm, still bleeding freely. Margaret's stomach turned, but her hand stayed steady as she examined the wound. Deep, but clean. It would need stitching. "Noah, get me the clean cloth from the cupboard, and the bottle from the top shelf, the one with the clear liquid." The boy scrambled to obey while Margaret pressed a towel against Caleb's hand, applying pressure to slow the bleeding. Caleb hissed in pain but didn't pull away. "Told you that roof was dangerous," Margaret said, her voice sharper than intended because fear made her angry. "Wasn't the roof's fault," Caleb said. "Was my own carelessness. Started thinking about other things instead of paying attention to what I was doing." Their eyes met, and Margaret saw something in his gaze that made her breath catch. He'd been thinking about her conversation with Noah, about staying, about possibilities that neither of them should be entertaining. She looked away first, focusing on Noah as he returned with the supplies. "This is going to hurt," she told Caleb. "The alcohol will burn, and I'm going to have to stitch it closed." "I've had worse," Caleb said, but his jaw was tight. Margaret cleaned the wound with steady hands while Caleb went white around the mouth but made no sound. Noah hovered nearby, his small face pinched with worry. When Margaret threaded the needle, she kept one ready for exactly this kind of emergency. The boy turned away. "Noah, go check on the chickens," Margaret said gently. "But Papa..." "We'll be fine. I've stitched up more cuts than you can count. Go on now, give us some privacy." The boy left reluctantly, and Margaret set to work. The first pierce of the needle made Caleb's whole body go rigid, but he held still, his free hand gripping the edge of the table with white-knuckled force. "Breathe," Margaret murmured, her voice gentler than before. "It'll go faster if you breathe." "Trying," Caleb managed. They fell into silence broken only by Caleb's controlled breathing and the soft sound of needle through skin. Margaret worked quickly but carefully, her stitches neat and even. This close, she could smell the sweat on him, the tang of blood, the faint scent of wood smoke that clung to his clothes. This close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the gray starting at his temples, the scar on his chin that looked old and deep. "How'd you get that?" she asked, nodding at the scar. Talking would help distract him. "Bar fight, would you believe? Years ago, before Noah, before I got sense in my head. Some drunk took exception to something I said. Bottle broke, things got ugly." He managed a weak smile. "My wife, Sarah was her name. She patched me up and told me I was the biggest fool she'd ever met. Then she married me anyway." "Sounds like she was the fool," Margaret said, but there was no malice in it. "Maybe. But she was my fool." The past tense made his voice heavy. "We had 6 good years before the fever took her. 6 years of happiness I never thought I deserved." "And Noah?" "Born in year 2. Sarah used to say he was half me, half her, and all miracle." Caleb's eyes went distant with memory. "She made me promise before she died that I'd give him a good life, that I wouldn't let grief turn me bitter. I've tried to keep that promise." Margaret tied off the final stitch and wrapped his hand in clean bandaging, her movements gentle. "You've done well by him. He's a good boy. Happy, despite everything." "He deserves more than drifting," Caleb said quietly. "Deserves a real home, a place to grow roots. I keep telling myself the next job will be the one, the place will finally settle, but I never find it." "Maybe because you're looking for perfect instead of possible," Margaret said before she could stop herself. Caleb's eyes found hers, intense and searching. "What if I found both?" The question hung between them, weighted with meaning that made Margaret's pulse race. She stood abruptly, putting distance between them, her hands trembling now that the crisis had passed. "You should rest that hand. No more work today." "Margaret, Mrs. Hale," she corrected automatically, but her voice shook. "Mrs. Hale," Caleb repeated, standing slowly. He crossed the distance she'd created, stopping just close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes. "I know I'm overstepping. I know I got no right to say what I'm about to say, but these past few days, being here, seeing you work yourself half to death trying to save this place alone, it's been eating at me." "Don't," Margaret whispered. "You don't have to be alone," Caleb continued, his voice low and urgent. "You're strong and capable, and you've survived things that would break most people. But surviving isn't the same as living, and you deserve more than just getting by." "You don't know what I deserve," Margaret said, but she couldn't step back, couldn't look away. "I know you deserve someone who sees you, really sees you. Not the widow, not the failing homestead, but the woman who took in strangers because it was the right thing to do. The woman who stitches up fools who hurt themselves on her roof. The woman who's scared to death of hoping again, but does it anyway every time she looks at her ledger and decides to try one more season." Margaret felt tears burning behind her eyes. "Stop." "Why? Because it's true? Because you feel it too?" "Because you're leaving." The words burst out of her, raw and desperate. "In a few days, the roads will clear and you'll move on to your next job, your next town. And I'll still be here, alone, trying to hold together something that's already broken. So don't stand there and tell me I don't have to be alone when being alone is all I've got." Caleb reached out with his good hand, his fingers brushing her cheek so gently it made her ache. "What if I didn't leave?" The world seemed to stop. Margaret stared at him, afraid to believe, afraid to hope. "What? What if I stayed, Noah and me? What if this was the place we've been looking for?" "That's insane," Margaret breathed. "You don't even know me." "I know enough. I know you're stubborn and proud, and you fight like hell for what matters to you. I know you're lonely even though you pretend you're fine. I know you've got walls built so high you can barely see over them, but you let us in anyway." His thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone, and she couldn't bring herself to pull away. "I know that when you smile, really smile, not that polite thing you do, it changes your whole face, makes you look young again." "I'm not young," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "I'm 52 years old, Caleb. I'm old enough to be your—" "My what? My mother?" You're 15 years older than me, Margaret, not 50, and I've never cared about numbers on a calendar. He stepped closer, and she could feel the heat of him, the solid presence that had filled her empty house and started to fill her empty heart. I care about finding someone who makes me want to stop running, someone who makes me think about building instead of just getting by, someone who makes my son light up when he talks about maybe staying. Noah said something, Margaret whispered. He's been saying it for 3 days straight, asking if we could stay, if you might let us stay, if maybe we'd found home. And what did you tell him? That it wasn't up to me. That it was your house, your life, your choice. Caleb's hand cupped her face fully now, his bandaged palm resting against her shoulder. So I'm asking, not for charity, not for pity. I'm asking if you consider letting us stay. I'd work this land with you, fix what needs fixing, build what needs building. Noah would have a real home, a chance to go to school, put down roots, and you wouldn't have to carry everything alone anymore. Margaret closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the impossibility of it all. You're asking me to trust you, to believe that you won't wake up in a month or a year and realize you made a mistake, that you'll look at me, really look at me, and see an old woman instead of whatever fantasy you've built up in your head. I'm asking you to take a chance, Caleb said simply. Same as you took a chance letting us in during the storm, same as I'm taking a chance telling you how I feel when you could throw me out into the snow. I should throw you out, Margaret said, but her voice had no strength behind it. I should tell you you're crazy and send you on your way before this gets any more complicated. But you won't. How do you know? Because you're still standing here. Because you haven't pulled away. Because I see it in your eyes. You feel this too, whatever this is. You're just scared. Margaret opened her eyes and met his gaze, seeing the truth there, the hope, the fear, the fragile possibility hanging between them. Of course I'm scared. Love is for young people, Caleb. People who have time to recover from mistakes. I don't have that luxury. Who says it would be a mistake? Life says. Experience says. Common sense says. But your heart? Caleb asked softly. What does your heart say? Margaret's breath caught. Her heart, that treacherous organ, was pounding so hard she thought he must feel it. Her heart was screaming at her to say yes, to take this impossible chance, to reach out and grab hold of this unexpected gift before it slipped away. But her head, her practical, scarred, self-protective head, knew better. I can't, she whispered, stepping back, breaking contact. The loss of his warmth felt like amputation. I can't do this, Caleb. I'm sorry, but I can't. Pain flashed across his face, quickly masked. Can't or won't? Does it matter? It does to me. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, feeling cold despite the warmth of the stove. You should rest your hand, and tomorrow, if the weather's clear enough, you should think about moving on. I'll pay you for the work you've done, more than fair. But I think it's best if you go. Best for who? Caleb's voice was rough now, hurt bleeding through. For you? For Noah, who's finally found a place he wants to call home? Or are you just so damn afraid of being happy that you'd rather push away the best thing that's happened to you in years? You don't know what's best for me, Margaret snapped, anger rising to cover the hurt. You don't know anything about my life, about what I've lost, about how hard it is to keep going when everything you built turns to dust in your hands. You waltz in here with your easy smiles and your kind words, and you think that's enough? That I should just forget 7 years of surviving on my own because some drifter decides he wants to play house? The words were cruel, designed to wound, and she saw them land. Caleb's face went hard, closed off in a way it hadn't been since that first night. You're right, he said, his voice flat. I don't know. And I was a fool to think I could. He turned and walked to where Noah had laid out their bedrolls, began rolling them up with sharp, angry movements. Margaret watched, her heart screaming at her to take it back, to apologize, to stop him, but pride and fear kept her silent. The door opened and Noah came in, stopping short when he saw the tension in the room. Papa, what's wrong? Nothing, son. Pack your things. We're leaving. But the storm is clearing, and we've overstayed our welcome. Noah's eyes found Margaret's, confused and hurt. But I thought, Mrs. Hale, I thought, you thought wrong, Margaret said. hating herself but unable to stop. This was always temporary. You knew that. But Papa said maybe. Papa was mistaken, Caleb interrupted, his voice gentle with his son, even as his eyes stayed hard on Margaret. Sometimes people aren't ready for help, Noah. Sometimes they'd rather be alone. We have to respect that. Even when it makes them sad? Noah asked, his voice small. Caleb's jaw worked. Even then. They packed in silence the small sounds of gathering belongings absurdly loud in the quiet house. Margaret stood frozen, watching her brief moment of companionship being erased, watching the warmth drain from her home as surely as heat escaped through cracks in the walls. This was better, she told herself. Cleaner. They'd leave now, before she got any more attached, before Noah started feeling like the grandchild she'd never have, before Caleb's presence became necessary instead of just pleasant, before she made the mistake of believing she deserved this. Caleb finished packing and shrugged into his coat, then helped Noah with his. The boy was crying silently, tears tracking down his cheeks, but he didn't argue. Margaret felt each tear like a knife to her heart. The road south should be passable, she heard herself say. Follow it about 5 miles. You'll reach the Hendersons' place. They have horses. They'll help you get to town. Thank you, Caleb said, formal and distant. For the shelter, for the food, for tending my hand. For nothing, Margaret thought, for absolutely nothing. He moved toward the door, Noah's hand clasped in his, and Margaret knew this was her last chance. One word, one gesture, and he'd stay. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way he hesitated at the threshold. He was giving her one final opportunity to change her mind. But the words stuck in her throat, trapped behind years of self-protection and fear. She watched him open the door, watched the cold rush in, watched him guide Noah out into the snow. Mrs. Hale. Noah's voice drifted back, small and sad. Yes, Noah? Thank you for letting us stay, even if it was just for a little while. It was nice having a place that felt like home. The door closed behind them, and Margaret stood alone in her house, her empty, silent, hollow house, and felt something inside her shatter. She moved to the window on numb legs and watched them trudge through the snow, 2 figures growing smaller against the vast white prairie. Caleb's shoulders were set against more than just the wind, and Noah kept looking back, as if hoping to see her running after them. But she didn't run. She just watched until they disappeared over the rise, until they were swallowed by distance and her own cowardice. Then, and only then, did she let herself break. Margaret sank to the floor, her back against the wall, and wept. Great, wrenching sobs that tore out of her chest, years of loneliness and grief and stubborn pride spilling out all at once. She cried for Thomas, dead 7 years and still defining her life. She cried for her children, scattered and distant, their absence a constant ache. She cried for the woman she used to be, before loss taught her that loving meant losing. But mostly, she cried for what she'd just thrown away. For Caleb's kindness and Noah's hope and the possibility of something new, something good, something that might have healed the wounds she'd carried for so long. She cried until she had no tears left, until her throat was raw and her eyes swollen, until the light faded from the windows and darkness crept in. The fire in the stove burned down to embers. The cold settled into the room like an unwelcome guest. And still she sat there, too empty to move, too broken to care. Hours passed. The moon rose, casting silver light across the snow-covered prairie. And in that cold, clean light, Margaret finally let herself see the truth. She had been surviving. Just surviving for 7 long years. She'd convinced herself it was enough, that needing nothing meant she couldn't be hurt. But Caleb had been right. Surviving wasn't living. And somewhere along the way, she'd forgotten the difference. Thomas wouldn't have wanted this for her. Her strong, laughing Thomas, who had loved life and lived it fully, right up until the moment it ended. He wouldn't have wanted her to bury herself along with him, to wall herself off from joy because joy could end. He would have wanted her to try, to risk, to open her heart one more time, even knowing it might break again. Emma and James, distant as they were, would want the same. They hadn't left because she was bitter. They'd left to build their own lives, as children do. And maybe, just maybe, they stayed away because coming back meant watching her slowly disappear into loneliness, and they didn't know how to stop it. But there was someone who did know, someone who had seen her clearly and offered not pity, but partnership. Someone who looked at her aging face and worn hands and saw not burden, but possibility. Someone she'd just sent away because she was too afraid to believe she deserved a second chance. Margaret stood slowly, her body stiff from sitting so long on the cold floor. She moved to the window and looked out at the moonlit prairie, at the tracks leading south that Caleb and Noah had left behind. The snow was already beginning to fill them in, erasing the evidence of their passing. But it wasn't too late. Not yet. The tracks were still visible, still followable. If she hurried, if she was brave enough, she could catch them. Could tell Caleb he was right, that she was terrified but willing to try. Could ask Noah to forgive her for hurting him. Could choose hope over fear, living over surviving. It would mean risking everything. It would mean trusting that this time love wouldn't be ripped away. It would mean believing at 52 years old that she was still allowed to want things, to need things, to build a life that included more than just endurance. Margaret pressed her hand against the cold glass, her breath fogging the window. In the reflection, she saw herself as she was, gray-haired and lined and tired. But she also saw what Caleb must have seen: strength, resilience. A woman who had survived the unsurvivable and was still standing. A woman who deserved more than just standing. The decision crystallized in that moment, sharp and clear and terrifying. She could stay here, safe and alone, watching the years pass until age or debt or simple loneliness finished her. Or she could run out into the cold and chase down the best thing that had happened to her in 7 years. She could choose survival, or she could choose life. Margaret turned from the window and grabbed her coat. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons, clumsy with urgency and fear that she'd already waited too long. The coat felt heavy on her shoulders, or maybe that was just the weight of 7 years of isolation pressing down on her, trying to keep her rooted in place. Margaret grabbed her shawl, wound it around her neck, and reached for the door handle, then stopped. What was she doing? Running after a man she barely knew, chasing some fantasy that a wandering cowboy and his son could fill the emptiness Thomas had left behind? She was 52 years old, for heaven's sake. Too old for this kind of foolishness. Too old to go sprinting across a frozen prairie in the moonlight like some lovesick girl. But Noah's face rose in her mind. Those dark eyes so full of hope, then so full of hurt when she'd crushed it. And Caleb's voice, patient and sure, telling her she didn't have to be alone, telling her she deserved more than survival. Her hand tightened on the door handle. Pride had kept her safe for 7 years. Pride and the fear that if she reached for happiness again, it would be snatched away just like before, leaving her even more broken than Thomas's death had left her. But what had safety given her? 4 walls and a failing farm, and nights so quiet she could hear her own heart beating out the lonely rhythm of her days. Margaret yanked open the door. The cold hit her like a slap, stealing her breath, but she pushed forward into it. The moon was bright enough to see by, turning the snow-covered prairie into an endless expanse of silver and shadow. The tracks Caleb and Noah had left were still visible, 2 sets of footprints leading south, already softening at the edges as new snow began to fall. She started walking, then running, her boots punching through the crust of snow, her breath coming in gasps that turned to clouds of vapor in the frigid air. The cold burned her lungs, made her eyes water, but she didn't slow down. Couldn't slow down. Every second she hesitated was another second they got farther away, another second closer to disappearing from her life forever. Caleb! Her voice came out thin, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the prairie. Caleb, wait! The wind picked up, throwing snow in her face, and Margaret stumbled, caught herself, kept going. Her shawl whipped behind her. Her fingers went numb inside her gloves. But she could still see the tracks, could still follow them over the first rise and down into the shallow valley beyond. Please, she called again, louder this time. Caleb! And then she saw them. 2 figures in the distance, dark against the snow. They'd stopped, had turned back toward her voice. Even from here, she could see the tension in Caleb's stance, the way Noah pressed against his father's side. Margaret forced her tired legs to move faster, half running, half stumbling through the drifts. Caleb started toward her, his long strides eating up the distance between them. And then he was there, his hands on her shoulders, steadying her. Margaret? What's wrong? What happened? She couldn't speak yet, her lungs too starved for air, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. She bent over, hands on her knees, trying to catch her breath, while Caleb's concerned face swam in her vision. "Mrs. Hale?" Noah's voice, worried and confused. "Are you okay?" Margaret straightened slowly, meeting Caleb's eyes. In the moonlight, they were dark and bottomless, filled with concern and something else, something that looked like hope he was afraid to acknowledge. "I'm sorry," she managed finally, her voice rough. "I'm so sorry for what I said, for pushing you away, for being too scared and stubborn to see what was right in front of me." Caleb's hands were still on her shoulders, his grip firm but gentle. "Margaret, no, let me finish, please." She took a shaky breath. "You were right, about everything. I've been surviving instead of living. I've been so afraid of losing again that I stopped letting myself have anything worth losing. And when you offered me something real, something good, I panicked and drove you away because that felt safer than taking a chance." The wind moaned around them, but Caleb didn't speak, just waited for her to continue. "I'm 52 years old," Margaret said, and her voice cracked. "I'm set in my ways and sharp-tongued, and I don't know how to be anything other than alone anymore. I'll probably drive you crazy within a week. I'll probably mess this up in 100 different ways. But if the offer still stands, if you still want to stay, then I'm asking you to. I'm asking you to take a chance on a bitter old woman who's forgotten how to hope." "You're not old," Caleb said quietly. "And you're not bitter. You're scared. There's a difference." "I'm terrified," Margaret admitted. "Of failing you, of failing Noah, of letting myself believe this could work and then losing it all over again." "I'm scared too," Caleb said, and the admission seemed to cost him something. "Scared that I'm seeing something that isn't there, that I'm wanting so badly for Noah to have a real home that I'm fooling myself about the rest. Scared that you'll wake up one day and realize you made a mistake letting drifters like us into your life." "Then we're both fools," Margaret said. "Maybe." Caleb's hands moved from her shoulders to cup her face, his touch gentle despite the roughness of his calloused palms. "Or maybe we're just two broken people who found each other at exactly the right time." Noah had been watching this exchange with wide eyes, his gaze darting between the two adults. Now he spoke up, his voice small but determined. "Does this mean we can stay for real?" Margaret looked down at the boy, seeing the hope blazing in his face, the desperate need to believe that this time, finally, they'd found a place to belong. She remembered her own children at that age, remembered how much they'd needed security and stability and the certainty that home would always be there. She knelt in the snow so she was eye level with Noah. "It means I'd like you to stay, if you want to, if your papa wants to. It won't be easy. This farm barely makes enough to support one person, let alone 3. And I'm not always easy to live with. But if you're willing to work hard and be patient with a stubborn old woman who's forgotten how families work, then yes, I'd very much like you to stay." Noah launched himself at her, his small arms wrapping around her neck in a fierce hug that nearly knocked her backwards into the snow. "I'll work so hard," he promised, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "I'll feed the chickens and haul water and fix things, and I won't complain, I promise. Please don't change your mind, please." Margaret's arms came up automatically, holding the child close, and something in her chest cracked open. She hadn't held a child like this since her own were small, hadn't felt this fierce protective surge since Emma and James were young enough to need her. The feeling was overwhelming, terrifying, absolutely right. "I won't change my mind," she whispered into Noah's hair. "I promise." Caleb was watching them with an expression that made Margaret's breath catch, raw emotion playing across his face, hope and relief and something deeper that she wasn't ready to name yet. He extended his good hand to help her up, and when she took it, he pulled her close enough that she could feel the warmth of him even through their heavy coats. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly, for her ears only. "Really sure? Because if we stay, if we do this, I'm all in, Margaret. I don't do things halfway. I'll work this land with you, build it up, make it thrive. I'll be here through bad seasons and good, through whatever comes. But I need to know you're sure, because Noah, he can't take another loss. Neither can I." Margaret looked up at him, this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying. His face was weathered and careworn, marked by hard years and hard losses, but his eyes held a steadiness that called to something deep inside her. "I'm sure," she said, and meant it. "I'm terrified, but I'm sure. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Caleb said, and smiled. That real smile that transformed his whole face. "Because I'm terrified too." They stood there for a moment, the three of them forming a small circle in the vast emptiness of the snow-covered prairie, and Margaret felt something shift inside her. Not the walls coming down, that would take time, she knew, but maybe a door opening, maybe a window letting in light. "We should get back," she said finally, "before we all freeze to death out here." The walk back to the house felt different than the frantic run-out. Margaret was acutely aware of Caleb beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. Noah walked between them, his small hand clasped in hers, chattering excitedly about all the things he'd help with, all the ways he'd make himself useful. "I can learn to milk cows if you get cows," he was saying. "And I'm real good at gathering eggs. I won't break any, I promise. And Papa can teach me carpentry so I can help fix things. And maybe we could get a dog? I've always wanted a dog." "One thing at a time," Caleb said, but he was smiling. "Let's make it through the winter first." The house came into view, lamplight still glowing in the window where Margaret had left it burning. It looked different to her now. Not a prison of solitude, but a home waiting to be filled with life again. Still shabby, still showing its age, but full of possibility. Inside, the warmth enveloped them like an embrace. Margaret busied herself stoking the fire and putting coffee on, while Caleb and Noah shed their outer layers. The domestic routine of it felt strange and comfortable all at once. "You should look at your hand," Margaret said, nodding at Caleb's bandaged palm. "Make sure you didn't tear the stitches running around in the cold." "It's fine," Caleb said, but he let her unwrap the bandage and examine her work. The stitches had held, though the wound looked angry and swollen. Margaret applied more salve and rewrapped it carefully, hyper-aware of his eyes on her face as she worked. "Thank you," he said when she finished. "For this, for coming after us, for taking the risk." "Thank you for waiting," Margaret replied. "For not going so far I couldn't catch you." "I was walking slow on purpose," Caleb admitted, "hoping you'd change your mind, praying you would." Noah had settled at the table with a cup of warm milk, his eyelids already drooping. The excitement and emotion of the evening had caught up with him, and he looked ready to fall asleep where he sat. "Bedtime for you," Caleb said gently. "It's been a long day." "But I'm not tired," Noah protested, even as he yawned. "Bed anyway. We've got plenty of time now. No need to cram everything into one night." Margaret watched as Caleb carried his half-asleep son to the bedroll and tucked him in with practiced ease. The tenderness of it, the casual intimacy of a father caring for his child, made her chest ache with memories of Thomas doing the same for Emma and James. When Noah was settled, Caleb returned to where Margaret stood by the stove, and the air between them suddenly felt charged with things unsaid. They were alone now, really alone, and the magnitude of what they'd agreed to seemed to fill the small space. "I should probably sleep," Margaret said, but made no move toward her bedroom. "Probably," Caleb agreed, but didn't step back. They stood there in the lamplight, the fire crackling, the wind whistling around the eaves, and Margaret found herself studying his face, really looking at him for the first time without her defenses fully raised. He had kind eyes, she thought, tired and sad in places, but fundamentally kind, and his mouth, bracketed by lines that spoke of smiling more than frowning despite the hardships life had dealt him. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now?" Caleb considered. "Now we figure it out as we go. I'll finish the roof repairs, shore up the outbuildings. Come spring, we'll assess what needs planting, what livestock we can afford. We'll make a plan for making this place profitable again." "That's the practical answer," Margaret said. "But what about—" She gestured between them, unable to find words for the complicated tangle of feelings neither of them had fully named. Caleb took her hand, her rough, work-worn hand, and held it gently. "What about this? What about the fact that I look at you and feel something I haven't felt since Sarah died? What about the fact that you scare the hell out of me and fascinate me in equal measure?" "I scare you?" Margaret couldn't help a small laugh. "Terrify me," Caleb confirmed. You're strong in ways I'm not. You've survived alone, built a life from nothing, refused to give up even when giving up would have been easier. That kind of strength is intimidating. I don't feel strong, Margaret admitted. Most days I feel like I'm barely holding on. That's what strength is, Caleb said. Holding on when letting go would be easier. Keeping going when stopping would be simpler. You've been doing that for 7 years, Margaret. That's not weakness. That's heroic. No one had called her heroic in her entire life. Stubborn, yes. Difficult, certainly, but never heroic. The words settled into her chest, warm and unexpected. I don't know how to do this, she confessed. How to let someone in again. How to trust that this won't end in loss and grief. Neither do I, Caleb said. But maybe we can figure it out together. Take it slow. Give ourselves time to learn each other. No rushing, no pressure. Just seeing where this goes. I'm not a young woman anymore, Margaret felt compelled to say again. I can't give you more children. I can't be the kind of wife who… Stop, Caleb interrupted gently. I'm not asking you to be anything other than who you are. I have Noah. I don't need more children, and I'm not looking for some idealized version of a wife from a storybook. I'm looking at you, Margaret, the real you, and that's more than enough. The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking loose something she'd been holding tight for too long. More than enough. When had anyone last made her feel like she was enough, exactly as she was? I don't know what to say, she whispered. Then don't say anything, Caleb said. Just accept it. Accept that someone sees value in you, that someone wants to build a life with you, not despite your age or your sharp tongue or your stubbornness, but including all of it. Margaret felt tears pricking at her eyes again, but these were different from the desperate sobs she'd shed earlier. These were softer, warmer, tinged with something that might have been hope. This is going to be complicated, she said. Probably. We're going to fight. Definitely. I'm going to push you away sometimes because it's what I know how to do. And I'll be patient, Caleb said, because I know what it's like to be scared of losing something precious. And I'll remind you as many times as it takes that I'm not going anywhere. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so old-fashioned and tender that it made her breath catch. The scrape of his beard against her skin sent an unexpected shiver through her. I should let you sleep, he said, but his eyes held a question. Margaret knew what he was asking. Not for anything improper. They were both too careful, too aware of Noah sleeping nearby, too conscious of taking things slow. But asking if she was all right, if she needed space, if the evening's emotions had been too much. I'm all right, she said, and realized it was true. Shaky and uncertain and still scared, yes. But all right. Maybe more than all right. Good. Caleb released her hand slowly. Sleep well, Margaret. You too, Caleb. She retreated to her bedroom and closed the door, leaning against it as she had the night before. But everything was different now. The emptiness she'd felt then had been replaced by something else. Not fullness exactly, not yet, but the beginning of it, the promise of it. Margaret changed into her nightgown and climbed into bed, pulling the quilts up to her chin. Through the thin walls, she could hear the small sounds of Caleb settling in for the night. The rustle of blankets, the creak of floorboards, the sigh of a man finally allowing himself to relax. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind was racing. Tomorrow, everything would be different. Tomorrow, she wouldn't wake up alone. Tomorrow, there would be coffee already made and voices in the house, and work to be done together instead of in solitude. Tomorrow, she'd have to figure out how to let these two people into her carefully ordered life, how to make room for their needs and wants and presence. It would be awkward at first, full of missteps and adjustments, and moments when she'd want to retreat back into her safe isolation. But it would also be full of possibility, of laughter and conversation and shared meals, of watching Noah grow and learn, of building something new with Caleb, something neither of them could build alone. Margaret pulled the quilt closer and let herself imagine it. Spring coming, the land greening, the three of them working side by side to plant and tend and harvest. Noah running through the fields, his laughter carried on the wind, Caleb beside her at the day's end, both of them tired but satisfied with what they'd accomplished. a real life. Not just survival, but living. The thought should have terrified her. And it did, a little. But underneath the fear was something stronger, something she'd thought long dead. It was hope. Margaret fell asleep with a smile on her face, the first genuine smile she'd worn in 7 long years. And in the main room, Caleb lay awake on his bedroll, staring at the ceiling, his own heart full of the same fragile hope. They had a long road ahead of them, he knew. Trust would take time to build. Margaret's walls wouldn't come down overnight. There would be setbacks and doubts and moments when the past threatened to strangle the future before it could bloom. But they'd taken the first step. Margaret had chased him down through the snow, had chosen possibility over safety, and that meant something. That meant maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. Beside him, Noah stirred in his sleep, and Caleb reached out to rest a hand on his son's shoulder. This was what he'd wanted for so long, a real home for his boy. A place to stop running, a woman who could be partner and friend, and maybe, eventually, something more. He'd found it in the last place he'd expected, with the last person he'd thought would need him. Margaret with her fierce independence and guarded heart. Margaret who'd survived alone and learned to prefer it, or told herself she did. Margaret who'd run out into the freezing night rather than let him walk away. Caleb smiled in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adjustments, new fears to face. But tonight, they were all under the same roof, all choosing to try, all taking a leap of faith into an uncertain future. And sometimes, that was enough. Outside, the wind had finally died down. The snow had stopped falling. And over the eastern horizon, just visible through the window, the first hint of dawn was beginning to lighten the sky. A new day was coming, a new beginning. And for the first time in 7 years, Margaret Hale would wake up to the sound of voices in her house, to the smell of coffee she hadn't made, to the presence of people who had chosen to stay. She would wake up to possibility. She would wake up to life. And though she didn't know it yet, sleeping peacefully in her room with a small smile still on her face, she would wake up to love. Morning arrived with a softness Margaret hadn't expected, pale winter sunlight filtering through her bedroom window and painting everything in shades of gold. For a moment she lay still, listening to the unfamiliar sounds that had become her new reality. The low rumble of Caleb's voice, Noah's bright laughter in response, the clatter of dishes being handled with more enthusiasm than skill. They were making breakfast. In her kitchen, without asking. The old Margaret would have bristled at the intrusion, would have swept in and taken over, reclaiming her territory with sharp words and sharper looks. But this morning she found herself smiling instead, savoring the simple joy of waking to a house full of life. She dressed quickly and emerged to find chaos of the best kind. Noah stood on a chair at the stove, carefully watching eggs sizzle in the pan, while Caleb guided his hand on the spatula. Flour dusted the table where someone had attempted biscuits, and the coffee, bless them, was strong enough to strip paint. "Good morning," she said, and both heads turned toward her with matching grins. "We made breakfast," Noah announced proudly. "Papa said we should let you sleep, that you probably didn't sleep good after all the excitement." "Didn't sleep well," Margaret corrected automatically, then caught herself. "But that was thoughtful. Thank you." Caleb met her eyes over Noah's head, and the warmth in his gaze made her chest tight. "Hope you don't mind us taking liberties with your kitchen." "I think I can forgive it this once," Margaret said, accepting the coffee cup he offered. She took a sip and managed not to wince at the strength. "Though we might need to discuss proper coffee measurements." "Too strong?" Caleb asked, his mouth quirking. "It's perfect," she lied, and his laugh told her he knew it. They ate together at the small table, Noah chattering about his plans for the day, while Caleb listened with the patient attention of a man who had practice hearing the important things beneath the childish enthusiasm. Margaret found herself watching them both, memorizing details. The way Caleb's hair stuck up on one side where he'd slept on it, the gap in Noah's smile where he'd lost a tooth, the easy comfort they had with each other that spoke of years spent as a tight unit of two. And now they were letting her in. The thought was humbling and terrifying in equal measure. "What's the plan for today?" she asked when Noah paused for breath. Caleb wiped his mouth and pushed his plate aside. "I need to finish securing that section of roof before the next storm hits. After that, I was thinking we should take stock. Figure out what this place needs to get through winter and what can wait till spring." "We need everything," Margaret said bluntly. The list of what doesn't need fixing would be shorter. Then we prioritize, Caleb said calmly. Shelter first. Roof, walls, anything that keeps the weather out. Then heat. Make sure we have enough wood, that the stove's in good repair. Then food. Assess what you've got stored, what we need to supplement. Everything else waits. Margaret nodded slowly, appreciating his practical approach. I have some money saved. Not much, but enough for supplies if we're careful. I have some too, Caleb said. We pool resources, make them stretch, and come spring, we plant everything we can, build the herd back up if possible. This place could be profitable again with the right work. You sound confident, Margaret observed. I am, Caleb said simply. I've seen worse land than this produce good yields. It just takes time and sweat and knowing what you're doing. He paused, his expression growing more serious. But I need to know your thinking, Margaret. What do you want this place to be? A working farm again? Just enough to support us? Something in between? It was the first time anyone had asked her that question, had treated her vision for the land as something that mattered. Thomas had made the decisions about the farm, and after his death, she'd been too busy surviving to think about thriving. I want it to be whole again, she said slowly, working through thoughts she'd never articulated. I want to look out at these fields and see life instead of failure. She stopped, surprised by the emotion in her throat. I want it to be something I can be proud of again. Caleb reached across the table and covered her hand with his good one. Then that's what we'll build. The next weeks fell into a rhythm that felt both strange and right. Caleb worked from dawn to dusk, his injured hand healing slowly but not stopping him from tackling the endless repairs the homestead needed. Margaret found herself working alongside him more often than not, holding boards while he hammered, mixing mortar while he laid stone, learning the satisfaction of building instead of just maintaining. Noah became her shadow when he wasn't helping his father, following her through daily chores with endless questions and boundless energy. At first, Margaret found his constant presence exhausting. She'd grown so used to silence that the boys' chatter felt overwhelming. But gradually, she began to appreciate it, even look forward to it. His curiosity reminded her of Emma at that age, before loss had made Margaret too tired to encourage wonder. Why do chickens lay eggs every day? Noah asked one morning as they scattered feed. Because that's what their bodies are made to do, Margaret said. Like how your body grows whether you think about it or not. But what if they get tired? What if they want a day off? Margaret smiled despite herself. Then they stop laying. Chickens aren't slaves, Noah. They do what comes natural to them. Do people do what comes natural too? The boy's face was serious, thoughtful beyond his years. Sometimes, Margaret said carefully, when we let ourselves, when we're not too busy being afraid. Noah considered this, then nodded as if she'd confirmed something he suspected. Papa says you were afraid, but you're getting braver. The simple observation, delivered with a child's directness, made Margaret's chest tight. Your papa talks too much. He says that's one of his faults, Noah agreed cheerfully, but he also says talking about hard things makes them easier. Is that true? Margaret looked down at this small person who'd wandered into her life and refused to let her hide. I'm starting to think it might be. The days grew shorter as winter deepened its hold, but the house felt warmer than it had in years. Caleb proved to be handy with more than just repairs. He could cook a decent stew, told stories that had them all laughing until their sides hurt, and had a gift for making even the hardest work feel bearable through companionship. But it wasn't all easy. There were moments when Margaret's old defenses rose up, when she snapped at Caleb for moving something or changing a routine she'd maintained for years. Moments when she retreated to her room and closed the door, needing space from the constant presence of others. Moments when the fear came roaring back, whispering that this was temporary, that she was foolish to rely on it. Caleb, true to his word, was patient. He gave her space when she needed it, pushed gently when she needed that instead, and never made her feel broken for struggling with what should have been simple. You've been alone a long time, he said one evening after she'd apologized for snapping at him over something trivial. It's going to take time to get used to sharing space again. I'm not going anywhere just because you're having a hard day. What if I have a lot of hard days? Margaret asked, hating the vulnerability in her voice. Then we'll get through them together, Caleb said simply. That's what partners do. Partners. The word settled into her bones, warm and solid. Not master and servant, not even husband and wife yet, but partners. Equals building something together. As Christmas approached, Margaret found herself thinking about traditions she'd abandoned after Thomas died. The small evergreen they'd always cut and decorated with strings of berries and paper chains. The special meals she'd prepare, using precious sugar and butter for pies and cookies. The way Emma and James would vibrate with excitement, making the whole house feel magical. She mentioned it hesitantly one evening, expecting Caleb to dismiss it as frivolous, given their tight budget. Instead, his face lit up. Noah's never had a real Christmas. We've always been on the road, making do with whatever we could manage. If you want to do it right, I'm all for it. They spent a day tramping through the woods at the edge of the property, Noah running ahead to examine every tree until he found one he declared perfect. It was scraggly and lopsided, but they cut it down together and dragged it back to the house with a sense of ceremony that made Margaret's throat tight. Decorating it became a project that consumed them all. Margaret showed Noah how to string berries, her fingers remembering the motion even after years of disuse. Caleb carved small wooden ornaments, a horse, a chicken, a house with a crooked door that made them all laugh. And Noah contributed drawings on precious paper, each one carefully hung with pride. On Christmas Eve, they sat around the little tree with cups of hot cider sweetened with the last of Margaret's honey. The lamplight made everything soft and golden, and for the first time in 7 years, Margaret felt something that went beyond contentment into actual joy. I have something for you both, she said, suddenly nervous. She retrieved 2 packages she'd hidden in her room, a warm scarf she'd knitted for Caleb during the long evenings, and a small wooden horse for Noah that she'd commissioned from the woodworker in town during her last supply trip. Noah's face when he unwrapped the horse was worth every penny she'd spent. It's perfect. Look, Papa, it's just like thunder. The horse they'd had to put down seemed less of a tragedy now that Noah had this small memorial. Caleb unwrapped his scarf slowly, his expression unreadable. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with emotion. Thank you. I'll treasure it. It's just a scarf, Margaret said, embarrassed by his intensity. It's the first gift anyone's given me since Sarah died, Caleb said quietly. So no, it's not just a scarf. They had gifts for her too. Noah presented a drawing of the 3 of them standing in front of the house, all smiling, all together, and Caleb gave her a small wooden box he'd made, perfectly fitted joints and a lid that opened smoothly to reveal a mirror inside. So you can see yourself the way we see you, he said. Beautiful and strong and worth every bit of effort it took to convince you to let us stay. Margaret looked at her reflection in the small mirror, her gray-streaked hair, her lined face, her work-roughened hands. But for the first time in years, she didn't see failure or age or disappointment. She saw a woman who'd survived, who'd taken a chance, who was learning, slowly, to live again. Thank you, she whispered, closing the box carefully. That night, after Noah had fallen asleep clutching his wooden horse, Margaret and Caleb sat by the dying fire, the comfortable silence between them deeper than words. I've been thinking, Caleb said finally, about the future, about making this arrangement permanent. Margaret's heart stuttered. Permanent how? Marriage, Caleb said simply. Not right away. I know you need time, but eventually. When you're ready, I want Noah to have stability, to know this is his home for good. And I want, he paused, choosing his words carefully. I want you to know I'm committed to this, to you. Not just the farm or the convenience, but you, Margaret. Margaret stared into the fire, watching flames dance over the logs Caleb had split that afternoon. Marriage. The word felt weighted with history and hope in equal measure. Her marriage to Thomas had been good, built on young love and shared dreams. But this would be different, a partnership forged by 2 people who'd learned life's hardest lessons and chosen each other anyway. I'm 52 years old, she said, not for the first time. And I'm 37, Caleb said patiently. We've established the numbers, Margaret. They don't scare me. What scares me is the thought of you saying no because you think you're too old to deserve happiness. What if I'm difficult, she asked. What if I can't be the wife you need? What if you already are? Caleb countered. You think I need someone young and biddable? I need a partner, Margaret. Someone strong enough to challenge me, smart enough to catch my mistakes, stubborn enough to keep going when things get hard. I need you, exactly as you are. Margaret turned to look at him, this man who'd appeared in a storm and refused to leave even when she'd tried to drive him away. His face was open, honest, offering her everything without demanding anything in return except the chance to try. Ask me in the spring, she said finally, when we've made it through a full season together, when we've had time to be sure this isn't just winter loneliness talking. Caleb smiled, that slow, warm smile that transformed his whole face. Spring it is. But Margaret, I'm already sure. Well, one of us should be, Margaret said, but she was smiling too. Winter deepened and then began slowly to loosen its grip. The days grew incrementally longer. The snow melted in patches, revealing the brown earth beneath, and the three of them worked together to prepare for spring planting, making plans and lists and decisions as a unit. Margaret watched Caleb teach Noah how to prepare soil, how to read the weather, how to care for the land that would feed them. She saw her homestead through their eyes. Not a failing enterprise, but something with potential, something worth the hard work it would take to restore it. And somewhere along the way, without quite noticing when it happened, the walls around her heart came down. Not all at once, not with dramatic fanfare, but quietly, stone by stone, until one morning she woke up and realized she was happy. Genuinely, deeply happy in a way she'd forgotten was possible. She told Caleb that morning over breakfast, the words tumbling out awkwardly. I'm happy. I wanted you to know. In case I forget to show it or say it. I'm happy you stayed. Caleb set down his coffee cup and reached for her hand. I'm happy too. Happier than I've been since Sarah died. And I think... He glanced at Noah, who was absorbed in his breakfast. I think she'd be glad that we found you, that Noah has a home and I have a partner. She'd want that for us. Margaret squeezed his hand, understanding the gift he was giving her, permission to honor his past while building their future. I think Thomas would feel the same. He was never one for waste, and me sitting alone in this house letting it fall apart would have driven him crazy. They smiled at each other, two people carrying ghosts who'd learned that loving again didn't mean forgetting. It meant honoring what came before by refusing to let it destroy what could come next. Spring arrived in earnest in late March, bringing rain and mud and the backbreaking work of planting. They worked from dawn to dusk, all three of them, coaxing life from the soil that had lain fallow too long. Margaret's back screamed in protest, her hands blistered despite the gloves, but every evening when she looked out at the neat rows they'd planted together, she felt a satisfaction she hadn't known in years. Noah thrived in the outdoor work, his thin frame filling out with good food and fresh air, his face perpetually sunburned and grinning. He made friends with the neighbor children when they came to help with planting, his easy laughter drawing them in. Margaret watched him bloom and thought about her own children, wondered if they'd ever come back to see what she'd built from the ruins they'd left behind. As if reading her thoughts, a letter arrived in early April. Emma's handwriting, familiar despite the years. Dear Mother, it began, and Margaret's hands shook as she read. James wrote to tell me he visited at Christmas and found strangers living in your house. I was concerned until he explained they seemed to be helping and that you seemed happy. I wanted to write and say that if this is true, if you found companionship after all these years alone, I'm glad. We never meant to abandon you, Mama. We just didn't know how to reach you through your grief. If you're happy now, truly happy, then I'm happy for you. Perhaps this summer I could visit. I'd like to meet the man and boy who accomplished what James and I could not, bringing you back to life. Margaret read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. She hadn't even known James had visited at Christmas. He must have come and gone while they were out working. But he'd seen enough to write to Emma, and Emma cared enough to reach out. She showed the letter to Caleb that evening, and he read it carefully before handing it back. Your daughter loves you, he said simply. She just didn't know how to show it when you were locked so far inside yourself. Are you going to write back? I don't know what to say, Margaret admitted. Tell her yes, Caleb said. Tell her to come visit. Let her see what we're building here. Let her see her mother happy again. So Margaret wrote back, her letter shorter than Emma's, but no less meaningful. Yes, Come in summer. Bring your family. There's room now, and I'd like you to meet Caleb and Noah. I'd like you to see what's becoming of this place. I'd like you to see that it's not too late, not even at 52, to start again." May brought the first shoots of green in their fields, tiny flags of hope pushing through the dark soil. It brought warmer weather and longer days and an energy that had all of them working with renewed purpose. And it brought Caleb to Margaret one evening as the sun set over their land, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. "It's spring," he said, his voice nervous in a way she'd never heard before. "You said to ask you in spring." Margaret's heart began to race. "I did say that." "Well, it's spring, and we made it through winter together without killing each other, which I count as a success." He took her hands in his, the one still bearing the scar of the injury that had brought him inside all those months ago. "So I'm asking, Margaret Hale, will you marry me? Will you let me stand beside you, not just for a season, but for all the seasons to come? Will you let us be a family, officially and forever?" Margaret looked at him, this good man who'd seen past her defenses to the lonely woman underneath. This patient man who'd taught her that love didn't have an age limit, that starting over wasn't admitting defeat, but claiming victory. This kind man who'd brought laughter back into her house and taught her aging heart that it could still feel young. "Yes," she said, and the word came out strong and sure. "Yes, Caleb Rowan, I'll marry you." His whoop of joy brought Noah running from the barn, and when the boy learned the news, he launched himself at both of them, creating a tangle of arms and laughter and happy tears. They stood there in the golden light, the three of them holding each other, and Margaret felt something she'd thought lost forever. She felt complete. They married on a Sunday in June beneath the old cottonwood tree that shaded the eastern side of the house. The preacher from town officiated while Noah stood between them, his small hands clasping theirs, his face split by a grin so wide it looked painful. Emma had come, bringing her husband and 3 children Margaret had never met. James had sent his regrets, but also his blessing, promising to visit in the fall. Margaret wore a simple dress in dove gray, nothing fancy, but Caleb looked at her like she was clothed in finest silk. And when he said his vows, promising to love and honor and stand beside her through whatever came, she believed him completely. Her own vows came from deeper than words, from the place in her heart that had thawed after years of frozen grief. "I promise to try," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "To keep trying, even when it's hard. To trust you, even when fear tells me not to. To build this life with you and choose hope over despair, always." When the preacher pronounced them married, Caleb kissed her gently, sweetly, a promise of more to come. Noah cheered and Emma wiped her eyes, and Margaret thought about how strange life was, how it could break you completely and then, when you least expected it, offer you a second chance at wholeness. The celebration was simple, a meal shared around the big table they'd built to accommodate their growing family, laughter and stories, and the easy comfort of people who'd chosen each other. Emma pulled Margaret aside at one point, her eyes serious. "You look happy, Mama, really happy. I haven't seen you look like this since before Papa died." "I am happy," Margaret said, and meant it. "I didn't think I could be, but Caleb taught me that it's never too late. That age is just a number and the heart doesn't keep track of years." "I'm sorry we left you alone," Emma said, tears spilling over. "I'm sorry we didn't know how to help you through your grief." "You were young," Margaret said, pulling her daughter into an embrace. "You had your own lives to live. I don't blame you for that. But I'm glad you're here now. Glad you get to see what your stubborn mother built from the ashes." That night, after the guests had left and Noah had fallen asleep exhausted from excitement, Margaret and Caleb stood together on their porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. His arm was around her waist, solid and warm, and she leaned into him, marveling at how natural it felt. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. "Not a single one," Margaret said. "You?" "Only that I didn't find you sooner," Caleb said. "But then again, maybe we both needed the years in between, needed to become the people who could appreciate what we found in each other." Margaret thought about that, about the bitter woman she'd been when he first knocked on her door, about how she would have driven him away permanently if he'd come even a year earlier, about how timing mattered almost as much as the people involved. "I used to think I was too old for love," she said, "too old to start over, too old to hope, too old for happiness. But you taught me that too old is just something we tell ourselves when we're afraid of trying. And are you still afraid? Caleb asked. Margaret considered, taking stock of her heart. There was still fear there. Life had taught her that loss was always possible, that happiness could be snatched away in an instant. But underneath the fear was something stronger now, something that had grown through the winter and spring, nurtured by Caleb's patience and Noah's joy and her own stubborn refusal to give up. I'm afraid, she admitted, but I'm not letting fear make my decisions anymore. I choose this, Caleb. I choose us. Every day, I choose us. He kissed her then, deeper than before, and Margaret felt herself responding in ways she'd thought her aging body had forgotten. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Margaret Rowan, he said. I've loved you since that first night when you stood in your doorway with a shotgun and let us in anyway. I'll love you tomorrow and every day after, until the day I die. I love you too, Margaret whispered, the words easier than she'd expected. I didn't think I could love again, but you made it impossible not to. They went to bed that night as husband and wife, and Margaret discovered that love at 52 was different than love at 20. It was gentler, deeper, built on understanding and acceptance rather than passion and possession. It was choosing to be vulnerable, choosing to trust, choosing to build something lasting with another broken person who'd survived the unsurvivable. It was, she thought, as sleep claimed her in her husband's arms, the most beautiful thing she'd ever experienced. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were droughts that tested their crops and their patience. There were harsh winters that reminded them how fragile survival could be. There were arguments and misunderstandings and moments when old wounds reopened and needed fresh tending. But through it all, they worked together. The homestead slowly transformed from a failing enterprise into a thriving farm. Their fields produced good yields, their small herd grew, and the house that had been so empty for so long filled with life. Noah's friends coming for visits, Emma and her family for summers, James finally making good on his promise to visit. Noah grew into a fine young man, tall and strong and steady like his father, but with a gentle heart that was all his own. He took to farming like he'd been born to it, and when he was old enough, Caleb began teaching him everything about working the land, about being a good man, about honoring the past while building the future. Margaret watched it all with a heart so full it sometimes ached. She watched her husband teach their son, because that's what Noah had become, in every way that mattered. And she saw Thomas in Caleb's patient instruction. She watched Noah laugh and grow and plan his own future, and she saw Emma and James in his enthusiasm and hope. She watched her empty house become a home, her silent days fill with conversation, her lonely nights transform into companionship. And she understood, finally, that love had no age limit, that it was never too late to start again, that the heart was capable of infinite healing if you were brave enough to let it try. On their 5th anniversary, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint their land in shades of gold, Noah, now a young man of 17, brought them coffee and settled beside them. I've been thinking, he said, about what happens after, when I'm grown and maybe have my own family. And? Caleb prompted. And I want to stay here. Build my house on the north section, work this land with you both. Raise my kids here, where they can know their grandparents. He looked at Margaret. If that's all right with you, grandmother. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Grandmother. The title she'd thought she'd never hear, given freely by a boy who had no obligation to love her but chose to anyway. More than all right, she managed. This land needs young blood, young dreams. Your father and I won't be able to work it forever. Then when you can't work anymore, you'll sit on this porch and give orders, Noah said, grinning, and I'll pretend to follow them, just like I do now. They laughed together, the three of them, and Margaret looked out at the land that had nearly defeated her and saw instead the land that had saved her. The fields Thomas had first plowed were green and productive again. The barn he'd built had been repaired and expanded. The house he'd raised his children in now rang with new laughter, new life, new hope. She had thought herself too old for love, too old for new beginnings, too old for happiness. But the cowboy who'd knocked on her door during a winter storm had taught her otherwise. He taught her that love could bloom at any age, that starting over was not admitting defeat but claiming victory, that the heart was capable of infinite renewal if fed with patience and hope. Caleb's hand found hers, familiar now after 5 years of marriage, but still capable of sending warmth through her entire body. She squeezed back, a simple gesture that contained everything they'd built together: trust and respect, passion and partnership, comfort and challenge. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" Caleb asked. "For not giving up. For seeing past the bitter old woman I was to the person I could still become. For teaching me that it's never too late." "You taught yourself," Caleb said. "I just waited. Like I said that first night, I've waited my whole life for you, Margaret, and you were worth every second of waiting." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder and watched the sun sink below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and gold. Tomorrow would bring new work, new challenges, new moments to navigate together. But tonight, she sat on her porch with her husband and their son and felt a peace so profound it seemed to fill her entire being. She had been lost, and now she was found. She had been alone, and now she belonged. She had been too afraid to hope, and now hope filled her days like sunlight. She had thought herself too old for love, but love had found her anyway, patient and persistent, in the form of a cowboy and his son seeking shelter from a storm. And in opening her door to them, she had opened her life to everything she'd been missing: laughter and companionship, purpose and passion, family and future. Margaret Hale Rowan closed her eyes and smiled, her heart full to bursting. She was 62 years old now, her hair completely gray, her hands gnarled with age and work. But she had never felt younger, never felt more alive, never felt more grateful for the gift of each new day. Because she had learned, finally, that love had no expiration date, that the heart could heal at any age, that it was never, ever too late to choose hope over fear, life over mere survival, love over loneliness. The storm that had brought Caleb and Noah to her door had been fierce and cold and unforgiving, but it had also been the greatest blessing of her life, bringing her everything she'd thought she'd lost forever. And as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Margaret gave thanks, not to fate or chance, but to the courage it had taken to open her door that winter night, to the patience Caleb had shown in waiting for her walls to come down, to the love Noah had offered without reservation, to the second chance she'd almost been too afraid to take. She gave thanks for every moment, every choice, every scared step toward happiness that had brought her here, to this porch, this land, this life, to this love that had taught her the most important lesson of all, that it's never too late to begin again.